Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exclusive Boom Room interview. This is Sasha with Arcanum Ventures. I'm joined by my good friend and colleague, Carmelo. And today we have a very special guest on, Sean O'Brien. He's the Associate Research Scholar at Yale Law School, Program Director of the Cybersecurity and Computer Science programs, as well as Assistant Professor at Bay Path University. On top of all that, he's a founder of the Yale Privacy Lab and Ivy Cyber, which is focused on secure products and software as well as privacy education for the masses. Sean, it's a pleasure to have you on. Someone so deep in the privacy space. Welcome. How are you?
I am so happy to be here.
Nice. I love that. You
Almost
are
sounded sarcastic. Sorry.
no, it's great. I know. I think we've spoken a few times, and I think we kind of understand that like you're really enthusiastic about not only everything privacy, but also how that fits into the world of blockchain and this like emerging technical landscape. You've got so many different titles and credentials, so it's very impressive. You might be the first scholar we've had on the Boom Room. And so I wanted to start this interview again, our audience members are aware of this and they're very in the know. We start every interview the same boring way, as boring as possible. So, with the same exact question, give us an idea of who is Sean O'Brien, what's your background, and how did you go on this journey where you ended up here today speaking with us about the cross section of privacy and cryptocurrency?
So essentially, I'm a geek. Okay. And that aspect has just shaped my entire life. I started putting my first website up on GeoCities, if anybody remembers that, back in
Old school.
1997 when I was 14 years old. So I've been sort of living and socializing and just kind of being on the web and connected for a very, very long time. But that part of it was always this creative kind of journey, right? I always wanted to make stuff, put things up, publish, get things out there. And I always sort of had this relationship with computers where it was all late nights, and so a lot of people did, right? And
Oh yeah.
so really big into the free and open source software, really big into the free and open web, which we actually sort of had back then. And I was a sysadmin for about 2 decades. So, running servers, databases, etc. It's how I got through college, right? And then I kept working for universities. That whole time, I was always an educator. So when people ask me this in a school context, I usually say, well, the most essential thing you can say about me if you stripped everything else out is that I'm an educator, right? I like to actually go through that process of having a conversation like this, learning from the students, and then hopefully the students learn from me, right? And imparting what information I have, whether or not it's wisdom, that's up to you. But this all of the stuff that I've had the pleasure of doing in my life, all of the negative experiences I've had in my life that you can learn from, and then obviously, all the tech. I started getting into security and privacy, cybersecurity, all that stuff, probably around the time of Occupy. So I was always doing security a little bit, right? Everybody was. And you can't run servers without being concerned about it. But that time period started getting specifically difficult, let's say, on the internet. You had a lot of people basically running automated bots, all kinds of attacks that we were just seeing for the first time. And also, you had activism, right? You had people who were being basically targeted by surveillance because of their political beliefs and because they were getting stuff done that was frankly impactful, right? So I started doing digital self-defense workshops, as I call them, surveillance self-defense workshops. And then that transitioned into doing it for basically lawyers, right?
Hmm.
The legal clinics at Yale Law, folks around Yale Law, they need strong encryption, anonymity, just like everybody else does. But of course, they handle high profile cases. And, they're high profile people often. So, sort of when people needed or asked for or wanted to know, how do I send this in this secure way? How do I use Tor? I heard about this thing called Tor. What the hell is the dark web? That kind of thing. Those questions tended to just go towards me. And from that, we founded this initiative called Yale Privacy Lab. And then from that, did a cybersecurity curriculum for Yale. And then pretty much everything else has followed. So I'm working on some cool stuff now.
That's
Incredible.
amazing.
The the Occupy movement. When you said it, it all clicked into place for me, right? Because I think of this time period. If it's not now, maybe then was the golden era. You might call it, maybe a bad word for it, a golden era of online misinformation as well, and information manipulation. And so I imagine you've seen your fair share of all sorts of different types of social engineering experiments when it comes to like digital identity and also like social media manipulation. So, like, did that also kind of push you towards that, or was it more so focused on like the surveillance side around like large government organizations or authorities?
Well, I was very passionate, as we all were, although people have stopped being as passionate, partially because of the Snowden disclosures, right? That sort of put a fire under everybody's ass and made sure that they were actually paying attention to the fact that the government pwned everything, right? So there's that aspect, just generally there was this feeling that we were being watched in ways that we weren't aware. But mostly, I would say the concerns around activism were doing things like, setting up a wireless network that wasn't going to be spied on immediately because it was just open, right? Literally bringing routers to protests and things like that. Um, a little bit of it was the, kind of work that's done by legal observers, for example, where you like at the protest is have a support role. And then some of it was one-on-one training. And hey, when you're doing your communication, maybe you shouldn't be doing it out in the open on Facebook. Like maybe if you're going to use Facebook groups to contact people, make sure you then move to this instead, right? And there were some great groups that were doing stuff that I really should shout out here. Rise Up is one of them, riseup.net, May 1st, may1st.org. I don't, they changed the name of that collective to something else. But anyway, there were a lot of good groups who were doing that sort of thing. On the misinformation front, I've always hated social media, or at least social media of the kind that we have, right? And in 2011, I actually had worked on a project called Fooj Book, Fooj Book, which was my version of sort of like making fun of Facebook, but also it was an alternative social network. It used a set of protocols that now are called ActivityPub, which is the stuff that runs under Mastodon, right?
Hmm.
So we were building better networks back then, partially because of this information problem you highlight, I guess, but mostly because people just wanted to opt out from the surveillance, right? Um, the, uh, the amount of surveillance, but also studying. So I'm glad you highlight kind of like the studying that goes on of people, their social groups, their social graph, where they've been, who they've talked to, what they've done. That sort of stuff, that automation, I have spent quite a bit of time with. I think that conversation is starting again. I'm finding a lot of people who are suddenly bringing up Cambridge Analytica again, for example, who are talking about the way that tweets can be sort of correlated to create like a guilt by association sort of thing. And then also, we're seeing a lot of AI bots just in general that are impersonating. So
Oh yeah.
all this stuff is coming together pretty fast, and I do expect that the conversation around information flows and so-called misinformation, disinformation, etc., is going to be picking up steam pretty soon. Yeah,
It's a little bit terrifying.
yeah,
You brought up a good point. You said you became more interested around Occupy, but as the internet evolved from the earlier internet until what it was then and what it is now, how have you seen like the surveillance increase or change over time? Like right now, we have people being checked entering the United States. Their social media is being scoured just to make sure that they haven't been critical, and this is a huge difference from what it might have been maybe 20 years ago.
sure. So, I mean, my ethos around the internet was always sort of this open playing field, right? And everybody talks about it in glowing terms, but we really did have this concept. You had John Perry Barlow at the EFF, all this stuff about having like a real free open society on the internet, right? Projects like Wikipedia, getting information out there, getting information to people, making sure that people around the world, I mean, it is still an incredible information system for this. It's just getting polluted a lot. Um, when the web was first created, and this predates me a little bit, but it's important to know your history, so I always go back and try to learn it. When the web was first created, the real first browsers, they were actually designed to be a read-write system, not just a passive read system. Okay. So not only did they make it relatively easy to publish, easy, but they also ingested the HTML, right, or whatever the content was, and the browser itself would be configured to display it the way the user wanted it displayed, right? So you would read a document, and maybe it would come in, and it would be, I don't know, green text on a black background or whatever it was, right?
Yep.
There was this conscious idea that it was a tool for reading, learning, sharing, and of course, getting your own stuff out there, publishing, right? Um, and then that started to shift when the business interests took a hold of it. Specifically, actually, it started to shift when some of the controls over encryption were actually lifted that allowed banks, for example, to send transactions through the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we've started to get somewhat decent encryption being allowed by the United States government, not being held up by the export control laws to be used on the internet. At the same time, you had the dot-com boom, these big, enormous amounts of wealth that started coming in. And then we started seeing static websites. We started seeing websites being treated as a billboard, basically. And we started seeing that sort of version of the internet. We were used to that, right? We were used to banner ads being ugly. We had ad blockers. We could use that stuff. We still do, of course. But what we weren't used to is the ads looking back at us, right?
Yeah.
So it's one thing to have this sort of passive, annoying advertising, and maybe you could say it's justified, right? It's not the worst model for information flows and people to do business on the internet. But once the ads start passively collecting information about you, the profiles get built, and then these personas are built in these vast databases.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem. Okay. Now we have a situation where those big data sets, in Common Crawl, all these corpuses that the AI is trained on, are now really impactful in our lives. So it wasn't just enough that there was this sort of surveillance architecture going on, the surveillance industry which is vast and huge, studying us, tailoring the ads we see on a television based upon what we've just pulled up on our phone, or maybe what we just said in a room. That wasn't good enough. Now we have artificial intelligence just studying everything about us, and then potentially you have the ability to spin up personas and pretend to be people. That sort of studying is bad. That sort of population control is bad. I don't know exactly where it's going. I have already seen some of the cracks in the promises of generative AI, and I kind of feel like we shouldn't overstate, where things might end up. But yeah, the stuff you're talking about with borders, believe me, that's the primary use or issue that people contact me about.
Oh, wow.
Travel's hard. Travel's always been hard, right? But it's really hard now. And generally speaking, my advice is back up as much as you can, wipe as much as you can,
Wow.
have
Okay.
devices that are strongly encrypted that you don't mind leaving at the airport if you have to. Keep everything off and don't answer any questions to the best of your ability, right? With entry, with visas, travel visas, and things like that, there are some questions you do have to answer. And then you have to be strategic. I mean, there are some folks, one of the individuals who came down to Hackers on Planet Earth with our Ivy Cyber crew, I advised him to take a train. Okay. He had to come down to Canada, and it was way longer than it should have been. But he sat on a train for 12 hours. So
That's wild, man.
Wow.
Is that specific to the U.S., or you just mean general travel around the world? You don't know the local circumstances depending on what country you're entering.
yeah, so the U.S. is, I think, particularly bad in this moment. Obviously, everybody's aware of that. I
Yep.
myself have had issues all over the place. The last time that was probably the worst for me was in Milan. But
Okay.
yeah, and
Wow.
they'll mark your ticket that you're going to be in secondary and all that stuff, and then you're in for it. So you have sort of this 2-hour preamble where now you're waiting to get, basically groped. So it is what it is. But, I've
Yeah.
done some work with a lot of interesting people. Let's say, I think when I'm pulled up in a computer, I don't have the typical profile. Um, so that's part of the work I do.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting you brought up, this idea of advertisements, and we've seen so many sacrifices around people's own private personal information, for loose justification, right? And like security is one thing, but it's interesting because I was listening to a podcast. It was kind of like the history of Meta, and it's very impressive what they've done with the platform, considering that they in part kind of made this shift towards more seamless advertising, developing these user personas, targeted advertisements. And the goal that they said was that they want to try and optimize for user experience on the platform. And now a lot of people, when they browse on their Facebook page, they can't even tell a difference between what is content being posted by a family member and what's an advertisement, right? Because these ads need to compete in order to get eyeballs. And it's so funny because I told Carmelo before how the direction we're going, and it's like all these companies are collecting all of your information. They're building psychological profiles of people so they could better sell them bubblegum, and there's been a really interesting change recently with the advent of, like, let's say chat gpt as an example, because it's maybe one of the largest and widely used llms, and how that's affected a lot of these advertiser models. And we've seen like reports of Google's ad revenue, or AdSense, I think, revenue dropping 80% because now they're incorporating Gemini and AI search results. And so it kind of bypasses all this click through, right?
Mhm.
But I wanted to ask you, because you might be in the best position to answer, um, what kind of conversations are being had around these private companies, their LLMs, and how they plan on maybe, let's say, I don't want to use the word manipulating, but changing results or output to potentially suit an advertiser or sponsor, because they're already operating as a black box. We don't really know
Mhm.
how these things are giving the results they do, and there's a lot of wiggle room in there to try and tweak the answer to maybe make a buck.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but you're pinpointing on something really important that I think a lot of folks aren't talking about. Um, so the first thing is, I don't even like doing A/B testing on users. Okay, I understand that marketers and sales folks want that data, and there's reasons they want that data. But the history of advertising has always been that. It's always been, how do we sort of manipulate the crowd to make sure we get the result? And this is why advertising and the history of propaganda go hand in hand, right? There's a lot of folks who've talked about this, but you can go back to characters like figures like Walter Lippmann, et cetera, et cetera. These people at the turn of the 20th century that sort of put together the democratic case, let's say, for advertising and what we would now call surveillance advertising, right? And basically, ads and propaganda, not that different. That said, you got to get out there, right? We need to advertise, right? We need to make sure people see your stuff. If you don't have any eyeballs on your stuff, you can have the coolest thing in the world, right? And people just aren't using it, aren't buying it. And then you can't pay your people, you can't pay yourself, you can't live, right? Um, so for the startups, it's one thing, right, to be doing some of the stuff and to be struggling and be kind of doing. But these large companies shape en masse the entire industry and the practices of the entire industry. And they started out with concepts like A/B testing, building that into software, just kind of studying where people click and things like that, to doing what people sometimes call, for scholars, sometimes call dark patterns, right? And that's the idea that you're really manipulating and putting somebody through basically a rat maze, right? Um, we're all used to that. Okay, we're all used to. I think you bring up the speculative bubble around these companies, right? The Facebooks, the Googles, and so on. Um, the old adage in advertising is, I'm wasting half my money in advertising. I just don't know which half, right? And that's traditional advertising. You can't pinpoint very well in a fine-grained way where your spend is basically trash, is not being utilized very well. And these ad marketplaces are owned by the folks who are giving you those results, right? You're saying you got XYZ impressions on this thing. Whatever an impression is up for debate and certainly not universal. And it starts becoming a money pit. When there are crisis events, the other large corporations that sort of make actual products, especially the car industry, industries like this, they stop putting their money into online advertising, digital advertising, for that reason. They have a budget for it, they're going to go after it, but they know that most of it is waste. So if they've got to cut something from the bottom line quickly, they're able to do that by just stopping the flow of waste into these corporations, right? I sort of see these large data flows between these corporations as ways that moneyed interests, let's say, are able to sort of move money between different corporations. There's sort of an unspoken kind of like handshake thing around, oh, well, Facebook doesn't actually make money, right? Google doesn't actually make money, but, they're worth this enormous amount of capital because there's an assumption that the data is worth something, right? And that's been the justification for collecting, sorting, studying the data specifically, and then also sending it downstream to intermediaries like what we would now call data brokers, right? These companies that make their bank basically just by huge database of information. The LLMs have been training themselves, geez, not yet. The LLMs have been trained to train on these huge bodies of information for, at least a little over a decade, right? ChatGPT sort of being unleashed on the public, roughly 2.5 years ago was sort of the big watershed moment that got everybody talking about generative AI. But this stuff has been going on for a long time. And if you've been paying attention to the industry, there always was this question, well, what's going to happen to search? What's going to happen to web browsers? What's going to happen to URLs and identity and all this stuff if you're sort of reducing the user experience and the interaction with the machine to a prompt where you just sort of wait and then you get the feedback and you act on that feedback, right? This sort of prompt response model. And I think Google is going to have they're already having their lunch eaten by ChatGPT, obviously. And I think search is going to be replaced or largely replaced by these LLMs, these prompt-based interfaces, essentially. At Ivy Cyber, there's a guy named Ted Rall, very well-known political cartoonist. He's syndicated all over the place. He's cartoons, you'd recognize the style of the cartoon if you saw it. He's very, very well known, been working in the industry for a long time. If you type his name into ChatGPT, even GPT-5, and hit enter, it'll break the prompt. It will not actually go through and finish the prompt for you. And now, when I try to get ChatGPT, for example, to talk about Ivy Cyber, or sometimes me, right? We need a YouTube summary, and we're just going to take this thing and put it, and it's got Sean O'Brien, Ted Rall, John Kiriakou on there, right? It'll break, it'll go Ted R, and it'll stop. And then actually it gets hopelessly broken, and you have to just kill the entire chat and start over. So we're being disappeared, Ted certainly is, by probably the most important piece of software of our time. And then guilt by association, right? So it's going to happen to me too eventually, or there'll be some remix about me. And I used to go in and like check, how much does ChatGPT know about me? I put a lot of myself on the internet. It's one of the ways I have some power in the information system and can help people. And, the joke is the privacy people are always the ones pasting their face all over the internet to give tutorials about privacy. Right? But if you go hide in a basement somewhere and you never pop your head out and you go the full prepper route, basically, then you're just a nobody. You have no power in any system. I used to just say the information system, but now that everything's digital, or intermediated by machines, it's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
So the black box manipulation of the information, I imagine it's happening already. I imagine it's happening based upon sort of defensive, we don't want people, like the thing where I can't remember what was being put on pizza or whatever. It was like these early embarrassing stories for ChatGPT where it would like give you a recipe and it would be like, oh, glue. I think it was glue, right? You would bring glue on pizza recipe. That kind of stuff, I'm sure is going on. But how much of an industry will they make it for themselves? I mean, why not partner with Coca-Cola and make sure that nobody ever says something bad about Coca-Cola, right? I could see that being very profitable, and I'm sure you're not the first person to have that idea. I don't know how much of that's going on. There's nothing that I'm aware of legally or logistically that would stop that from happening. And especially now, OpenAI, I'm just using them as an example, but it's obviously all of them. Um, they have all these layers on top of the actual LLM. So, like we talk about the LLM, but if you've ever just used a local LLM, which I encourage people to do instead, um, but if you use a local, they're sort of finicky and tricky, and they're sort of like AI was again 10 years ago, right? They didn't have all this stack of stuff on top of it to sort of keep the model within bounds. The other piece, which is sort of propagandistic, is that these models are now starting to show us the way they think, because there's an understanding that the user wants to know how the answer was arrived at, and that we're starting to have some skepticism around this technology in general. And I think when DeepSeek came through and they had the field that just said thinking and it showed the whole thing, well, now you have ChatGPT Think or whatever the model is, and they're starting to show you that. But that stuff's manipulated too, right? That's coming from somewhere too. It's at least coming from manual additions, right? So sometimes when you ask about certain things, that thinking output will always be the same. Well, that means it's programmed, right? It's not like the model actually going, well, because these models aren't people. So that's another parlor trick they're going to be playing on us too. A lot more to say there, but I am worried about manipulation of the information system. This is why we shouldn't have centralized services like this. This is why I used to call PrivacySafe, which is our brand of cool apps that we do. I used to call it the anti-cloud, right? Because cloud has always been a problem. We need decentralized services. You guys are blockchain folks, of course, you know that. But in the Web3 industry, we have a big problem with large intermediaries. We've got the Cloudflares of the world and these huge CDNs that everybody's reliant upon.
Yep.
Most blockchain would not work, would not function without basically large data farms that are caching, in the case of NFTs, JPEGs, right? But in the case of everything else, and then sort of now, as I'm sure you're aware, if you do go to a conference for blockchain or whatever, where there's a lot of bankers and stuff there, everybody's talking about making the assets more liquid, right? A big part of it is the liquidity. That's basically faking that the crypto actually went from one wallet to another, and then just having some assurance that's going to actually happen, right? You increase the liquidity and the speed, so called, by just saying, okay, yeah, okay, here's your asset. You definitely have it, right? But not your keys, not your crypto, right? So that sort of thing is going to happen more and more to all transactions, all information we do on the web as the LLM intermediaries get more ingrained. I'm worried that I'm going to send messages through applications to people and I won't know if it ever actually arrived. And then I might even have fake output sent to me, right? How
Oh,
can we
wow.
trust the application layer? How can we trust the buttons? And these companies have done it before. I worked with Ryan Nakashima on a story for the Associated Press back, I don't remember what year it was, 2018, something like that. And Google had a location toggle that actually wasn't turning off location services. So, and it was just in Android for, I don't know, years. So it's kind of a problem.
Wow. Yeah, you reminded me when you're talking about Facebook about I see it every so often, but the members of your family that post this general catch-all message like, I don't give Facebook the right to use my data in my photos, and they think that's enough to take care of it. And he reminded me because he said people used to care more about privacy, and then it kind of went away, and maybe they're waking up a little bit. But this is one of the biggest fundamental questions we always ask ourselves and people like yourself. But what will it take to get people to care more about privacy, and why don't they already care beyond that surface level? I'm going to put a Facebook message and I'm never going to look into this again.
So there's three things. One of them's sort of new, so I'm riffing on it here. I said it at Hackers on Planet Earth too, so we'll see how it lands. But there's three things I guess I would say about that with privacy. The first one is that the scope of what we call privacy is now unmanageable, right? It's certainly unmanageable for the average person, so-called, right? And what we're really talking about when we're talking about privacy is we're talking about these intermediaries sort of inserting themselves more and more into our lives in ways that encroach upon our autonomy, right?
Yeah.
So the second part, which I always say, so that's the first thing. The second thing is I always say we have to focus on autonomy, and we have to focus on sort of the use cases, the usefulness of privacy for the average person.
Hmm.
Sometimes that's going to be really simple stuff, right? They just don't, who wants photos of themselves first thing out of the bed, out of your bed in the morning, right? Who wants that on the internet? I guess a lot of people do these days. But, you may need privacy in the bathroom, right? These kinds of examples you can use all the time with people. And it's not hard to sell the average person on the idea that there has to be some privacy somewhere in this world, right? Um, you know, but the third piece I'll say, which is the most important in this context, and I make sure in our workshops when I'm asked by average people or people who haven't yet felt the sting of surveillance very strongly,
Hmm.
they say, "Well, why should I care? This stuff is so hard to do. You gave me some solutions, but you say it's a process. It's going to take me maybe even years to sort of get pretty good at having some privacy on the internet." Um,
Yeah.
I say don't fall into nihilism, right? But also, nihilism is a luxury. Okay, you don't
Oh
have to tell
wow.
targets or people who've been targeted why they need privacy,
Yep.
and that sort of thing will happen more and more, and is happening more and more as the AI is getting worse and worse. And it's not just about privacy; it's about the AI sort of encroaching into other parts of life and just ruining stuff. Okay, um, the generative AI polluting the internet. I mean, the chatbots, the automated calls.
Yeah.
My phone is blowing up. Everybody's phone is blowing up all the time now with SMS and phone calls because the data breaches, all the breaches, all that information is out there,
Hmm.
and then these AI bots now are just destroying it. For the average programmer who wasn't that into privacy or security, but may have had like a bug bounty program, you
Yeah.
can't even have a bug bounty program anymore because your inbox is just filled with trash. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So like these folks may not be the most passionate about going offline and going dark and all that stuff, but that stuff is sort of correlated. So I've also tried to use those examples. Um, we talked about it in the Twitter Spaces we had, but this so-called privacy paradox. It
Yeah.
is a real phenomenon in a sense. I just don't like calling it a paradox. People care deeply about privacy. People will use privacy as sort of a general word to mean sort of freedom almost.
Hmm.
Because without privacy, of course, you
Yeah.
can't
No.
have any freedom, right? But they don't do much about it, right? If you pull those same people and you ask them what they're doing about it, they feel powerless, et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course, people can't do anything or won't do anything in a system where they feel powerless, right? We see this all over the place. This is why we all eat junk food. Maybe not all the time, but every once in a while, you may be in a situation where you have no other food. I literally was this week, and I had Cheetos for the first time in I don't know how many years. Um, and it's like I know and the radioactive color of it, but it is what it is. So yeah, it's sort of that. I think it's really important to drill down into the basic use cases for people, and then to talk about the future, which is here pretty much. This is the revolution that we've been promised for a really long time. AI is an accelerating force, the same way COVID was an accelerating force. It's an accelerating force for digital trends, getting people into these systems generally, but also for surveillance trends, certainly. I've been saying for years that the accelerometer in your phone is going to be used to basically detect your gait so that if
Hmm.
you were to hand me your phone and I put it in my pocket,
Oh
the phone
wow.
would know. Yeah. And then if I try to get into a car and drive it, and I haven't paid my insurance or my electric bill, or I'm considered some enemy of the state or something, I don't think the car is going to start. I think we're going to have car computers that don't allow us to do that. Um, so that sort of thing, gets scoffed at still a little bit. People don't believe it's going to happen. We're going to see it, and it's going to be through the incentive system, right?
Yeah.
Which you guys brought up.
Yeah.
That's how it works here, and it's
Yeah.
not even like some terrible. If I do not have any money, I'm scraping by, things are rough enough, and I can get 10% off my car insurance, I'm going to put a GPS unit in my car to spy on me. I'm going to use the app that spies on me, you know, and you can't blame people. It's always this like take advantage of people in their desperation, you know?
Yeah.
Wow. You know, you brought up so many dystopian points. I don't even know where to begin. But like this idea of privacy focused education, like you said, is really important, and everyone's feeling the effects of maybe a lack of privacy. And like you mentioned, AI, this is a great example of how these tools are being used for malicious intent, right? On the other side of that coin, I want to ask a question about regulation at the risk of maybe our podcast getting canceled. But, there's a lot of incentive for these AI application developers of these LLMs to try and further their product and then monetize it through any of these sort of advertisement streams. And right now, it seems like over the past, I don't know, however many months, maybe the past year, we're in some sort of AI arms race, and every company is developing something new every day. There's some new feature. There are a million different startups that are using AI to develop new products. And so there's massive incentive to try and bring more AI control or AI powered tools to market. And it seems kind of hopeless for government or let's say regulating bodies to try and keep up. And we've seen that with blockchain. Before ChatGPT became very popular, it seems like just now lawmakers are talking about Bitcoin, which is crazy because Carmelo and I have been pulling our hair out for years trying to figure out when they're going to talk about unique digital asset use cases, as an example. And I just don't really see any way for government authorities to institute healthy regulation that's focused on privacy, because all of these LLMs are going to be training models on personal information. And now that blockchain is becoming more popular, a lot of traditional financial institutions are moving to blockchain. A lot of people's personal transactions are
Mm-hmm.
going to be accessible via blockchain. Now the game changes, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
not only do you have what this person does on Facebook every day accessible, but now you have all of their financial history and what groceries they buy and how frequently they buy it and how much money they're spending. And it seems like government or no one in general in any sort of regulating body is talking about that concern. So what's your take on maybe like what might progress there, or lack of progression might you see?
So, first, I must just say, I think a lot of these technologies that we're calling artificial intelligence right now, we're not going to call it that soon, right? Because as you pinpoint, it's just so deep in the stack. It's just such a big part of stuff. And in fact, what we're using AI as a byword for, this generative AI, is not really what you would have called artificial intelligence not that long ago, right? Deep Blue did not act in the way that a generative AI algorithm or prompt-based system works. A lot of the neural networks and things like that, computer vision and so on, traditionally don't act the way ChatGPT does. Excuse me for a second. Just need some water. Of course, it's vitamin water. It's not just water. Everything's got to be branded bullshit. But excuse me. I mean to swear on your stream. Anyway, so a lot of this is just going to be part of the stack. That's the bottom line. The other thing I'll say is that you do bring up very, very important points about surveillance that were already happening, and we had basically no regulation around that either. Okay. At Yale, Privacy Lab is part of something called the Information Society Project, right? Started in the early 2000s and actually the late 90s, I think. But at any rate, they have been talking about our information society for a long time. Those scholars there write very interesting and awesome stuff about regulation, around black box algorithms, around the perils of AI systems, the ethics around it. And they've been doing it for a long time, the whole time that I've been there. So it's not like people haven't been thinking about it. It's not like you don't have some of the top lawyers and legal scholars in the world, literally, at places like Yale Law, Harvard Law, et cetera, writing these huge, voluminous, articles about this stuff, and working with regulators sometimes to try to get some of this stuff through. But basically, we have a system right now, and the system is sort of getting deregulated. We're in a deregulation cycle, if we want to call it that. It's at the whims of really one individual in the executive branch. But let's assume it's not just that. It's also the bankers, also the the few folks in maybe 7 or 8 companies, running 8 companies, a huge concentration of power. And these folks are not going to allow regulation to be passed that has any real impact on them. I also don't really believe regulation is the best solution to these problems. I think it needs to go hand in hand with grassroots organizing and implementation. we have to build, and we have to ship, and we have to do it despite, whatever regulatory frameworks are out there. Because these companies can just treat, they have so much wealth, especially now, they can just treat any dings, any class action lawsuits, any penalties as just like an externality, like, it's like a rounding error, right? Um, when Apple got caught with its hand in the cookie jar, so to speak, spying on keywords from Siri conversations, they settled for $32 million. So what?
It's nothing. Yeah.
$1 trillion company, right? That's how it's going to go if the regulation comes through, and it's really unfortunate, but we've got to build instead. An example of this is something I actually presented at Hope, called Stick Talk. You can go out to sticktalk.com, sticktalk.com. It's an alternative front end for TikTok, that you can pop a TikTok URL in there. It'll download the video on this server in Iceland, not in the United States, not in China. No tracker code in there, no JavaScript that's going to snoop on you, none of that stuff. And then you can watch the TikTok video, and you can also just scroll through random TikTok videos that other people have done the same thing with. That sort of thing. We took some great open source code, we remixed it a little bit, and we threw it up on the web, right? We didn't ask for permission. We just did it. That attitude needs to just be done by more people, in my opinion. And I'm not trying to say we're some heroes for doing it or anything like that. These things are actually really, really simple to do if you just have a little bit of courage about it. Now, there's going to be lawfare. There's going to be all kinds of issues. You're talking about crypto. We could get into the privacy around. Anytime we have a decent mixer in crypto, the folks who are in charge of it could get hunted down, and they either end up going through a huge, long, terrible legal process and then eventually maybe get through it, or they end up having to plead guilty, as we just saw with Samurai Wallet, right? To some ridiculous charge, or they have to hide out somewhere, right? As we're seeing with Roger Ver and other people, right? So
Roman Storm as well. Like I think
yep.
in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and I wanted to ask you because we want to obviously give you some time to talk about what you're actually building. And to preface that, I wanted to ask what your philosophy or what do you think about how do you monetize this? Because we spoke with Session App, for example, who's obviously focused on privacy as well, end-to-end encryption, and all that. But we didn't get a chance to ask them, unfortunately. But like, how do you balance this? We're a company, or we want to make a living. We want to pay ourselves. We want to like not go hungry, but we also don't want to be predators and use data against people and sell it. So what kind of business model can you actually engineer from this? And after that, if you want to like run us through some of the coolest, I saw you have like an amazing suite of cool things that you guys are building on your website. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about some of that as well.
Awesome. Much appreciated.
Ivy Cyber.
Yeah. The Session folks are great. Session's awesome. All of these apps are great, that do real end-to-end encryption, that have their source published, that are serious about it, and who frankly are taking risks, right? Are going to be targets themselves for building some of this stuff, right? And making it useful. I've been in the open source community, game, whatever it is, for a long, long time. Work for a number of companies that are doing cool stuff. And I believe that the best model is probably a business-to-business one for your actual revenue, right? Because you're releasing the source code, you want the source code to be vetted, you want people to be able to use your stuff freely, right? I always say with the Ivy Cyber programs, with the apps we release, we're not your parents. We're not telling you what to do. So you can build your model around that. And so just to give a quick summary, so company is Ivy Cyber. We have some awesome folks involved in privacy education, anti-surveillance education. We've got ex-CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou is sort of our guiding light there. We're doing awesome stuff with him there. The brand of products under that umbrella is PrivacySafe. So you can go out to PrivacySafe.app. We're doing basically something that we think can solve or at least mitigate against a lot of the problems that folks have implementing end-to-end encrypted tools. Right now, as we saw with this so-called signal gate problem, right now, we see folks just sort of randomly ad hoc using whatever tool, jump into my WhatsApp group, jump into my Signal chat, just adding you to chats, et cetera, And this is happening in contexts that you may or may not be surprised about. You guys probably won't be surprised, but I've had people in uh, let's say pretty large police forces tell me that they have these off the record conversations in Signal, which they obviously shouldn't be doing.
Yep.
Folks
Wow.
working in hospitals, usually it's WhatsApp, but sometimes Signal with this stuff, and sometimes Telegram with this stuff. Sometimes, and organizations are starting to um, outsource, so to speak, without even knowing it or without even caring, the actual substantive conversations inside their own org. Um, and it's going to create all kinds of fallout if it hasn't already, not because there's a problem with the encryption technology, but because basically the conversations are happening outside of the organizational context. And by the way, if somebody screws up or they get breached, or in the cases Signalgate, where you had the top level government uh, officials using Signal. Some of them were using a fork of Signal called SGNL that was developed by an Israeli firm that is purposefully designed to record all the information that flows through. Okay.
Oh wow.
Oh, wow.
So these are issues, right?
Yeah, you can say that.
Yeah. So what we're doing is we've got a a chat app with, of course, audio and video calls for meetings. We've got an inbox like sort of email replacement interface. Looks like Thunderbird or Proton Mail or whatever, something like that. It can ingest real email,
Mhm.
encrypted or unencrypted. But your communications for your folks in your organization are end-to-end encrypted messages to
Okay.
each other by default. Okay, and everything's just marked accordingly, so you know the difference, etc.
Yep.
And then we have a Dropbox-like storage interface as well. So we think that set of tools together, shipped together, and then tied to the access controls of the organization, the identity of the organization, um, is a good model for basically selling to businesses, right? Selling to nonprofits, selling to, but it's also something that's useful for activists, small organizations, small teams, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so you do the hard work, you get on the ground, and you go after revenue. And we're building, we're shipping, we have some pilot customers. And we are actually also putting this stuff on a remix of a Linux operating system that's all full
Hmm.
disk encrypted on tablets. They're 12-inch tablets with a detachable keyboard, kind of Surface Pro style. So they're a little more like full-fledged laptops because we're trying to fit this more into the business context, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then we're working on phones as well. So we're going to keep going down this route, and we're basically going to build stuff, ship it where we can, package it in a tangible device that people can put in their hands. We're
Hmm.
partnering with Kate Gwallet. Just hung out with Vic Sharma in New York a couple days ago. Um, that was awesome. We were getting their stuff on these devices, so you'll have one of the best, if not the best, I think it's the best crypto wallet out there on devices that we're shipping alongside all these cool apps. And yeah, it's hard work, but it's like people ask, well, how are you going to stop terrorism if you don't just spy on everybody? It's the same kind of thing. It's like old-fashioned detective work, like old-fashioned detective work. Because guess what? The spying doesn't work very well. We've seen it a million times. They'll go back retroactively and they'll be like, yeah, we were contacted 50 times about this terrorist, being a problem before the thing happened. The thing happens anyway, and
Yeah.
everybody's information is snarfed into these surveillance farms. It's ridiculous. So anyway, if I
Mm.
can draw an analogy there, it's like we have to do things, unfortunately, the old way, and that's because it's fundamental. Because if you have no interest in participating in these surveillance-based revenue models, you have to go back to the basics. And by the way, the basics, there's a lot of room for. Most businesses, especially in the United States, are still small businesses, small to medium enterprise, right? As
Mhm.
Yep.
hard as it is now, and will get harder, in my opinion. We need to be working with each other, using each other's products, not just, going out and buying the whatever, the latest, greatest surveillance thing. And I'll also say just one more thing on this. I think there's a lot of room for blockchain in these contexts, and we have yet to
Yeah.
see it be implemented in those contexts. So I'd love to see other builders, starting to think a little more about how mom and pop shops can basically use this stuff. So,
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Man, Very exciting. I think like it sounds like you guys have like a privacy focused G Suite, which is
That's the
excellent
idea.
for anyone that's yeah like
Google without the
if you're
Google
if you're
would be
starting a
great.
business, yeah. If
Yeah.
you're starting a business, make sure you check out Ivy Cyber. And it's funny you brought up Cake Wallet. Shout out to Cake Wallet, and I think that's where we had originally met, where Carmelo was, he was hosting and he set up an X space that was focused on privacy, and you come on, and it blew both of our minds, the reception, how many people tuned in to listen, because this, I think, is a topic on everyone's mind lately, especially considering all the things that we've talked about. It's a shame that we're running out of time, and we have so many more questions to ask you, not only about Ivy Cyber, but about your role at the Yale Privacy Lab, and so many other things within the cross section of privacy and blockchain. Because this is like right now one of the largest growing metas in the industry. People talk about like new DeFi summer, stable coins, and privacy and DIDs. And we're definitely going to have you back on for a round two. But before we go, we're going to end the interview in the same way that we end every interview, with the same boring question. Before we do, I just want to remind everybody, if you're liking this content, make sure you tap that like button and throw us a subscribe. We've got plenty of more fun interviews coming. If you're interested in learning more about Sean and Ivy Cyber, check out the links in the show notes below. We'll make sure we link everything there for you. And Sean, before we go, I want to ask you, we've talked about a lot of like doomsday dystopian stuff, but let's try and end it on a positive note. And we'll do it a little bit different. We usually ask about like blockchain or crypto things, but when it comes to the world of privacy, and that can be maybe like the cross section of privacy and blockchain as well. What are you most bullish or optimistic about right now in that world? And it could be a product, a technology, a movement, a company, a person, anything. Oh, there's one rule though. It can't be your own company.
Come on. Yeah. I am actually very bullish on Monero. I do have to
Oh,
say.
okay.
Oh wow.
I've been heartened, not disheartened, by the response I've seen with them under attack. I've said, others have said in the past, I've heard it throughout the community, the Monero community and beyond, but basically, if Monero couldn't survive this attack by these basically private actors who are just spreading FUD, trying to basically destroy or make mining difficult, let's say, on the Monero chain, if it can't survive this kind of stuff, this kind of, fiddling, it's not even that impactful. It's so overblown. But let's say it were. Then we don't deserve to have it, so to speak. It shouldn't survive, if it can't survive this stuff. So I'm happy with what I've seen. I've seen people, really not just get inspired by it and suddenly renting, rigs to make sure they're counteracting, the negative impact of these private folks who are trying to take Monero down, so to speak, but also stopping the spread of FUD. Right, which is good. So they were reasonably able to counteract the narrative, and that's probably even harder. So I think it'll just go down as a blip on the radar, thankfully. And I think Monero is going to still survive quite well, and I think the fact that it's not being co-opted by Wall Street, the delistings from the exchanges, might be good for it. We're going to find some really, really interesting, really, really awesome applications for it. And yeah, I'm just going to be there for the ride. So
Sounds good. Yeah, I think a
Man,
lot of people were overstating the Monero fiasco that's been ongoing, but it's certainly been interesting to follow. But it's a good answer. I'm also heartened by the response as well and how they were able to. You're absolutely right. Like, if you can't survive that, then maybe that doesn't bode well for not just Monero, but like all of these proof of work blockchains and proof of stake blockchains.
yeah, I'm really glad you. I haven't been following so much, and so I've got to dive a little bit deeper into what's happening lately with Monero. But I'm just glad you didn't say meme coins. That would be really strange coming from you, I think.
it's not a 51%
Yeah.
attack, so let's never call it that. And maybe there's a lesson for everybody there. We have to not get into these cultural sort of memes throughout the community either. the R mine virus is a little bit. So, and I don't know, if people want to mess around on Uniswap, let them. But I'm just a little shocked at some of the speculation and the crazy movement in that part of the industry. It is what it is.
Mm. It is doing a good job of highlighting some like structural issues when it comes to how this technology works and manipulation, and like ultimately people are being educated.
Yeah.
That's my bright note on meme coins. Well, everyone, that's almost an hour in the books with Sean O'Brien. Sean from the Privacy Yale Lab and Ivy Cyber. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on and speak with you. And like I said before, we definitely want to have you on again and talk more around the world of privacy. We could talk about this for hours. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sean.
And then again, if anyone you're interested in learning more about Sean or Ivy Cyber, again, check out the links in the show notes. And until next time, y'all, thanks for tuning in. Ciao, everybody.